The snow fell in thick curtains that December evening in 1998, blanketing the Cascade Mountains in silence so absolute it felt like the world had stopped breathing. I was 24 then, a junior ranger stationed at the North Cascades National Park in Washington state, tasked with checking trail conditions before the holiday closures. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and the wind cut through my gear like broken glass. I almost didn't hear it. A sound, faint, not quite human, not quite animal. A whimper carried on the wind, fragile and desperate. I stopped, my breath clouding in front of my face, and listened. There it was again, coming from a cluster of fallen hemlocks about 30 yards off the trail. I found it curled beneath a broken branch, half buried in snow. A small, trembling creature no bigger than a cocker spaniel, covered in dark, matted fur. At first glance, I thought it was a bear cub, but the face was wrong. Too flat, too expressive. The eyes that looked up at me were dark and intelligent, filled with pain and something else I couldn't name. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. Its left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood had frozen in dark patches around the wound. Whatever it was dying. I didn't think. I pulled off my outer coat, wrapped the creature carefully, and radioed base. I've got an injured animal. Looks like, I don't know what it looks like. Maybe a primate. I'm bringing it in. The static crackled. There are no primates in the Cascades, Miller. I know that, I said, looking down at the small, trembling form in my arms. But tell that to whatever this is. I carried it 5 miles back to the ranger station through blinding snow, feeling its rapid heartbeat against my chest, its shallow breathing fogging the space between us. Every few minutes, it would look up at me with those impossibly human eyes, and I would whisper, "It's okay, I've got you." I didn't know then what I had found. I didn't know that this single act of compassion would bind my life to something beyond explanation, beyond science, beyond everything I thought I understood about the world. Some rescues don't end. Some begin a conversation that lasts a lifetime. The veterinarian we called, Dr. Sarah Chen from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Marblemount, arrived 3 hours later, her four-wheel drive barely making it through the accumulating drifts. She stood in the doorway of the station's small medical room, staring at the creature on the examination table, with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Pure, unfiltered bewilderment. "What am I looking at?" she asked quietly. "I was hoping you could tell me." She approached slowly, speaking in soft tones as she examined the injured leg. The creature, I had started thinking of it as male, though I had no real basis for that assumption, watched her with wary intelligence, flinching but not fighting as she palpated the fracture. The bone structure it's almost human. Primate, certainly. But the muscle density, the skeletal proportions. She looked up at me, her professional composure cracking. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Off the Cascade Pass Trail, about a mile past the fork. And you didn't see any others? No adults nearby?" I shook my head. "Just him, alone in the snow." Dr. Chen set the leg with practiced efficiency, using a splint designed for juvenile primates. The creature endured the procedure with remarkable stoicism, those dark eyes fixed on my face as if drawing strength from my presence. When it was over, she injected antibiotics and a mild sedative, and we watched as his breathing slowed and deepened into sleep. "He needs constant care for at least a week," Dr. Chen said. "Temperature regulation, feeding every few hours, wound monitoring. I can take him to the center, but honestly, the stress of transport in his condition..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He seems bonded to you already. That's significant." "Bonded?" "Primates form attachments quickly when rescued as infants. He trusts you. That trust might be what keeps him alive. So I kept him at the station." My supervisor, Frank, a grizzled veteran of 30 years in the Park Service, took one look at the creature and said simply, "Don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." I named him Ezra, a name that meant help in Hebrew. It seemed appropriate. Those first days were a study in the extraordinary passing as ordinary. I fed him a mixture of fruits, nuts, and protein supplements Dr. Chen provided. He ate slowly, methodically, watching my face as he chewed. His hands, and they were hands, not paws, moved with delicate precision, the fingers long and surprisingly articulate. He slept in a padded box near the wood stove, but by the third night, I woke to find him curled at the foot of my cot, his small body seeking warmth and proximity. When I reached down to touch him, he made a sound, not quite a purr, not quite a hum, that vibrated with contentment. "What are you?" I whispered into the darkness. His eyes opened, reflecting the dying firelight, and I could have sworn he understood the question even if he couldn't answer it. I began documenting everything in a private journal: his diet, his vocalizations, his behavior. Ezra was curious, playful, and remarkably intelligent. He learned to open latches by the end of the first week. He would mimic sounds, the creak of the door, the whistle of the kettle, even fragments of my humming. But more than that, he seemed to understand context. When I prepared to go outside, he would bring me my gloves. When the radio crackled with weather alerts, he would retreat to his box, as if he'd learned to associate the static with approaching storms. Dr. Chen visited twice more, each time more puzzled than the last. "His developmental rate is accelerated," she said during the second visit. "He's growing faster than any primate I've documented. And these vocalizations," she played back a recording of Ezra's sounds. "There's structure here, pattern, it's almost like..." "Language?" I offered. I was going to say proto-language, the kind of communication we theorize existed in early hominids. "You think he's a hominid?" She closed her laptop slowly. "I think he's something we don't have a name for yet, and I think you need to be very careful, Tom, because if the wrong people find out about this, they won't see a creature that needs protection. They'll see a discovery that needs to be dissected." Her words settled over me like ice. I looked at Ezra, who sat on the examination table grooming his healing leg with focused attention, and I made a decision that would define the next 20 years of my life. I would protect him, no matter what. By the end of that first month, Ezra's leg had healed completely. He was growing rapidly, already twice the size he'd been when I found him. Dr. Chen suggested I begin introducing him to the outdoors, to prepare him for an eventual return to the wild. "He's not domesticated," she reminded me. "Whatever he is, he belongs out there, not in here." I knew she was right, but every time I looked at Ezra, at the trust in his eyes and the way he reached for my hand when uncertain, I wondered if returning him to the wilderness that had nearly killed him was really the merciful choice, or if I was just afraid of losing the only miracle I'd ever touched. Spring came to the Cascades with its usual dramatic transformation: snowmelt rushing down ancient creek beds, wildflowers erupting across alpine meadows, and the forest awakening from its winter silence. Ezra, now 6 months old and nearly 50 pounds, had become my constant companion during off-trail patrols. He moved through the forest with innate grace, his dark fur blending seamlessly with shadows, his footfalls silent even in dry leaves. I had stopped trying to classify him in conventional terms. He was simply Ezra, unique, intelligent, and increasingly independent. But something was changing. He had begun to vocalize differently, deeper tones, more complex patterns, especially at dawn and dusk. Sometimes he would stop mid-trail, his head cocked at an angle, as if listening to frequencies beyond my perception. Once, I found him at the edge of a cliff, standing upright on his hind legs, a posture he'd only recently adopted, staring into the deep forest with an expression I could only describe as longing. "Do you hear them?" I asked quietly. "Your family?" He turned to look at me, and in that moment, I saw something that made my chest tighten: the awareness of his own otherness, the knowledge that he existed between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. I had been documenting everything in my journal: growth rates, behavioral changes, vocalizations, but I had shared none of it beyond Dr. Chen. Frank knew I was still caring for the creature, as he called Ezra, but he'd adopted a policy of willful ignorance. "What I don't know can't be subpoenaed," he'd said with dark humor. The problem was, Ezra was becoming harder to hide. He was now nearly my height when standing upright, with broad shoulders and arms that suggested enormous strength. His face had elongated slightly, the features settling into something distinctly non-human, yet disturbingly expressive. Hikers occasionally reported strange sounds or shadows in the backcountry. Twice I'd had to redirect search parties away from areas where Ezra and I camped. The contradiction was tearing me apart. My duty as a park ranger was to report significant wildlife, to document and protect. But my duty to Ezra, forged that night in the snowstorm, was to preserve his existence from a world that would never let him live in peace. Every scientific journal would want to study him. Every government agency would want to control him. Every media outlet would want to exploit him. The decision was made for me on a humid afternoon in July. I was returning from a solo patrol when I found Frank on the station porch, his face grave. Next to him stood a woman I didn't recognize. Late 50s, steel gray hair pulled back severely, carrying herself with the unmistakable authority of federal service. Tom Miller. She extended her hand. Dr. Margaret Voss, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Cryptozoology Investigation Division. My blood went cold. Cryptozoology? We received reports of unusual primate activity in this region. Focalizations that don't match any known species. Footprints that suggest bipedal locomotion in sizes inconsistent with any native wildlife. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. And interestingly, these reports cluster around your patrol routes. The Cascades are full of unusual sounds, I said carefully. Echo effects, wind through rock formations. Mr. Miller, I've been doing this for 23 years. I know the difference between acoustic anomalies and biological reality. She pulled out a tablet showing me photographs. A clear handprint in mud near a creek, too large for human, too articulated for bear. A broken hemlock branch 12 feet up, the break pattern suggesting intentional manipulation. I also know that you rescued something during that snowstorm in December. The veterinarian you called has been remarkably unhelpful, but her supply orders tell an interesting story. Primate nutritional supplements, specialized antibiotics, developmental tracking equipment. Frank looked at me with an expression of pained resignation. He'd tried to protect me, but this was beyond his authority. Dr. Voss, I said quietly, if I had found something remarkable, something vulnerable and unique, what would happen to it? That depends on what it is. She sat down on the porch steps, her tone softening slightly. I'm not here to cage anything, Mr. Miller, but if there's a viable population of an unknown hominid species in these mountains, that's not just scientific significance. That's a conservation crisis. These forests are shrinking. Climate change is altering habitats. If they exist, they need protection under the Endangered Species Act. And that requires documentation. Documentation that would reveal their location to everyone, I countered. Researchers, trophy hunters, curiosity seekers. You'd destroy their privacy trying to save them. So you admit they exist? I had walked into her trap, but as I stood there I realized I was tired of lying. Tired of the weight of secrets. Give me a week, I said finally. Let me think about this. Dr. Voss studied me for a long moment, then nodded. 1 week, Mr. Miller. Then I'm coming back with a full team, and I'd much rather have your cooperation than your obstruction. After she left, Frank put his hand on my shoulder. Whatever you've got out there, son, it can't stay hidden forever. You know that, right? I knew. I'd always known. That night, I hiked to the meadow where Ezra and I had been camping. He was there, silhouetted against the darkening sky, standing fully upright now, 7 feet tall and still growing. When he saw me, he made a low, rumbling sound that I'd learned meant greeting. I sat down on a log and he settled beside me, his massive hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture he'd learned from me months ago. Comfort through contact. They know about you, I said quietly, and I don't know how to keep you safe anymore. Ezra looked at me with those impossibly deep eyes, then did something he'd never done before. He reached out and gently touched my face, his fingers surprisingly warm and gentle. It was a human gesture, perfectly executed, and it broke something inside me. How do you protect something the world isn't ready to accept? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the campfire, watching Ezra in the flickering light and wrestling with an impossible choice. At some point before dawn, I felt his presence behind me. He'd learned to move with complete silence now, and then his weight as he sat down, close enough that our shoulders touched. We stayed like that until sunrise painted the peaks golden pink, two beings separated by biology, but connected by something deeper than species. Trust. The revelation came 3 days later, and it changed everything. I had taken Ezra deeper into the backcountry, to a remote valley I'd discovered years ago, a place where old-growth cedar stood like cathedral columns and the only sounds were wind and water. I thought if anywhere could remain his sanctuary, it would be here. We were crossing a boulder field when Ezra stopped abruptly, his entire body tensing. His head swiveled toward a dense thicket of devil's club and salal, and he made a sound I'd never heard before. A low, modulating call that seemed to carry for miles despite its softness. Then, from the forest came an answer. My heart stopped. The call was similar to Ezra's, but deeper, more resonant, carrying notes of complexity that sent chills down my spine. Ezra took 3 steps forward, then looked back at me, checking, I realized, to see if I would follow. Go ahead, I whispered. I'm here. What emerged from the trees was impossible, yet undeniable. A female, I thought, standing nearly 8 feet tall, her fur a russet brown with silver threading through it. She moved with the same fluid grace as Ezra, but with an added weight of years, of experience, of something I could only describe as wisdom. She stopped 20 feet away, studying me with eyes that held the same intelligence I saw in Ezra's, but tempered by caution and what might have been sorrow. Ezra moved between us, his posture submissive, making soft vocalizations that sounded like questions. The female responded, her sounds more varied, more articulated. They were communicating, not with words but with a language nonetheless, a language of gesture, tone, and something else I couldn't quite grasp. Then 2 more appeared, a larger male, easily 9 feet tall with massive shoulders, and a juvenile, perhaps 4 feet high, clinging nervously to what I assumed was its mother, a family. The reality hit me like a physical blow. Ezra wasn't alone. He had never been alone. There was a population, small perhaps but viable, living in these mountains, surviving in the spaces between human awareness, hiding in plain sight behind folklore and dismissed reports. The large male approached Ezra and I tensed, ready to, intervene? Against a creature that could snap me like kindling. But the interaction was gentle, a touch to Ezra's shoulder, a low rumbling that might have been approval or greeting. Then the male turned to look at me. I have been looked at by wolves, by bears, by mountain lions. I understand the weight of a predator's gaze. This was different. This was the gaze of someone evaluating not just threat level, but intent, character, perhaps even moral worth. I did the only thing I could think of. I sat down on the ground, making myself smaller, non-threatening. I placed my hands palms up on my knees in a gesture of openness. The male's expression, and yes, he had expressions, shifted subtly. He exchanged glances with the female, then made a series of gestures with his hands. The female responded in kind. They were discussing something, discussing me. Finally, the female approached. Each step was deliberate, measured. She stopped 5 feet away and lowered herself to a squat, bringing her face closer to my level. Up close, I could see the fine details. The intelligence in her eyes, yes, but also the scars on her arms, the slight graying around her muzzle, the way her breathing synchronized with mine as if to establish connection. She reached out one massive hand and gently, so gently, touched my shoulder, then gestured toward Ezra. "Thank you," I whispered, somehow knowing she would understand the sentiment if not the words. I didn't know he had family. She held my gaze for a long moment, then did something that made my breath catch. She touched her own chest, then Ezra's, then mine. The gesture was universal. Family. I understood then. Ezra wasn't just bonded to me. He had incorporated me into his understanding of kinship. And now his biological family was acknowledging that bond, accepting it, perhaps even grateful for it. The female stood and made a complex series of sounds and gestures to Ezra. He responded, then turned to me, his expression conflicted. The message was clear. He had to choose. "Go," I said, my voice rough. "Go with them. This is where you belong." But Ezra didn't move. He looked from me to his family and back again, trapped between 2 worlds, 2 loves, 2 versions of home. The male made a decisive sound and turned toward the forest. The female and juvenile followed. But before disappearing into the trees, she looked back once more, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that carried a clear message. "We will not forget this." Then they were gone, vanished into the forest, as if they'd never been there at all. Ezra and I stood alone in the clearing. He moved close, pressing his forehead against mine in a gesture of shared grief and shared gratitude. "They're here," I said softly. "Whenever you're ready, they're here. You don't have to choose forever. Just know you have a place with them." He made a soft sound, part acknowledgement, part question. The impossible had become real, and now I had to decide what to do with that reality. Dr. Voss was coming back in 4 days, and I had just learned that the secret I'd been keeping wasn't about one creature. It was about an entire hidden species whose survival depended on remaining hidden. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of fevered documentation and soul-searching. My journal, which had chronicled Ezra's development, now became something else entirely. Evidence of a viable population, anthropological observations, behavioral patterns that suggested complex social structures. The scientist in me was electrified. The guardian in me was terrified. I sat in my cabin, Ezra drowsing by the stove, his massive form somehow still managing to curl into the same position he'd adopted as an infant, and made lists. 2 columns. Report versus conceal. Report. Scientific validation of a species thought mythical potential federal protection under ESA research funding for habitat preservation documentation before potential extinction. Conceal. Maintains their privacy and safety, prevents exploitation and harassment, allows natural social structures to remain intact. Honors the trust they showed me, but the lists were meaningless. This wasn't a question of logic. It was a question of ethics that had no clear answer. I thought about calling Dr. Chen, but I knew what she would say. She was a scientist first, no matter how much she cared about her subjects. Discovery would always trump discretion in her worldview. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my father. He was 78, retired from 40 years as a biology professor at Washington State University, living alone in Spokane since my mother passed. We had a complicated relationship. His rationalism had always clashed with my more intuitive approach to the natural world. But he was the smartest person I knew. "I need your advice," I said when he answered. "About an ethical dilemma. Is this about that creature you rescued?" His voice was calm, unsurprised. "Sarah Chen is a former student of mine. She consulted me about your primate months ago. She told you she needed guidance on the biology. Don't worry, I've told no one. Client privilege, so to speak." He paused. "But I assume this call means the situation has escalated?" I told him everything. About Ezra's growth, about the family in the forest, about Dr. Voss's imminent return. He listened without interruption, which was unlike him, and when I finished there was a long silence. "Tom," he said finally, "you're asking the wrong question. You're asking, should I report this? When the real question is what serves their interests. And to answer that, you need to think like they do, not like we do. How do I think like a species that hides from human awareness? You observe, you infer. You understand that if they've survived this long without being documented, they've done so deliberately. They've adapted not just to the forest, but to existing alongside humanity while remaining invisible. That's not accident, that's strategy." His words crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. "You're saying their concealment is evolutionary?" "I'm saying that for a species with their apparent intelligence to remain undiscovered in the modern era, with satellites, trail cameras, DNA testing, requires either incredible luck or deliberate behavior. Which seems more likely? Deliberate. Then by reporting them, you're not helping them. You're undermining their survival strategy. You're making a decision for them that they've already made for themselves." It was the clarity I needed, but it brought new complications. So I lie to a federal investigator? I obstruct research that could establish legal protections? You consider that sometimes the highest form of protection is being left alone. His voice softened. There's a reason indigenous peoples across the Pacific Northwest have stories about these beings but never tried to prove their existence to outsiders. They understood something we've forgotten, that some things survive precisely because they remain mysterious. That proof is sometimes a death sentence. After we hung up, I looked at Ezra, who was awake now, watching me with those eyes that had witnessed me at my most vulnerable, confused, frightened, trying to do right in a situation where right had no clear definition. "Your family chose invisibility," I told him, "and I think I need to honor that choice." "But how?" "Doctor, Voss would arrive in 2 days with resources and authority I couldn't match. She would find evidence. I'd been too careless in the early months, too confident in the remoteness of our locations. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, possibly even hair samples or DNA, unless that evidence disappeared. The plan formed with the crystal clarity of desperate necessity. I would spend the next 2 days erasing every trace of Ezra's presence in the areas Dr. Voss would search. I would feed her investigation the acoustic anomalies and ecological explanations she expected, but wouldn't fully satisfy her. I would give her just enough cooperation to avoid legal consequences, while withholding everything that mattered, and I would move Ezra deeper into the backcountry, to the territory where I'd seen his family, and hope that he could finally integrate into the life he was born for. It meant lying to federal authorities. It meant potentially obstructing scientific discovery. It meant choosing loyalty to a creature, to a species, over loyalty to my own. But as I sat there in the cabin, watching Ezra groom his hands with the same careful attention he'd shown since infancy, I realized the choice had never really been mine to make. It had been made 20 years ago in a snowstorm when I'd picked up a dying infant and carried it to safety. Some rescues don't end. They just evolve into longer responsibilities. Tomorrow, I told Ezra, we start covering our tracks, literally and metaphorically. And then you go home, to your real home. He tilted his head, and I could have sworn I saw understanding in his expression. Understanding and something else. Sadness at impending separation, perhaps, or recognition that some bonds transcend proximity. I had 2 days to hide a species from discovery. It would have to be enough. The next morning, I began the process of erasure. It felt like trying to unwrite history, to take back every moment of the last 20 months and render them invisible. Ezra watched with patient curiosity as I used a pine branch to sweep away his distinctive footprints from the trails near my cabin. I scattered forest debris across areas where he disturbed vegetation. I removed the game camera I'd stupidly installed 3 months ago to document his nocturnal movements. Thank God I'd never uploaded those files to any cloud service. But as I worked, moving through familiar locations transformed by new awareness, I began to see things I'd missed before. Territorial markers that weren't Ezra's, scratches on trees at heights no bear could reach, arranged in patterns too deliberate to be random. A carefully constructed windbreak in a ravine, using techniques no storm could produce naturally. A cache of tools, yes, tools buried under a fallen log, smooth river stones shaped for grinding, sharp flakes of obsidian, a hollow gourd that could only serve as a container. They had been here all along, not just surviving but living, creating, existing in sophisticated social groups with technology and territory and intention. I was erasing evidence of Ezra while stumbling into evidence of an entire culture. The ethical weight nearly crushed me. This wasn't just about protecting one creature anymore. This was about an undocumented hominid species, possibly the closest living relatives to Homo sapiens, whose mere existence would rewrite anthropology, biology, and our understanding of consciousness itself. And I was choosing to bury that knowledge. Around noon, as I was carefully replacing disturbed stones in a creek bed where Ezra had played, he made a sharp warning sound. I froze, then heard it. Footsteps. Human footsteps. Doctor. Voss emerged from the tree line alone, wearing field gear and carrying a professional camera. She stopped when she saw me, her expression unreadable. "You're early," I said, my heart hammering. "I'm thorough." She gestured at the pine branch in my hand, at the 2 carefully arranged forest floor, and apparently just in time. There was no point in denying it. "Dr. Voss, Margaret, please." She sat down on a boulder, looking suddenly tired rather than authoritative. "Mr. Miller, Tom, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone outside my immediate team. In 23 years of investigating cryptozoological phenomena, I've documented 3 species that met the threshold for classification. 3. And do you know what happened to them?" I shook my head. The first was a population of deep cave salamanders in Kentucky. Within 2 years of documentation, their habitat was invaded by researchers, tourists, and collectors. The population dropped by 60%. The second was a nocturnal lemur species in Madagascar, filmed for a nature documentary that won awards. The lemurs were poached to near extinction within 5 years. Exotic pet trade. The third, she paused, her voice dropping. The third was a subspecies of river dolphin in Laos. We documented them, celebrated the discovery, and within 18 months, a resort developer had decimated their breeding grounds. The government couldn't or wouldn't stop it. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been where you are, standing at the edge of revelation, knowing that what comes next could be either salvation or destruction. She looked directly at me. "I saw the footprint cast, Tom. I saw the tool cache in the ravine. I've heard the recordings. I know what's here, and I need you to help me decide what to do about it." The confession hung between us like fog. This federal investigator with the authority to force disclosure was asking me for guidance. "You're the expert," I said carefully. "I'm an expert in documentation and classification, but you," she gestured toward the forest, "you've apparently built a relationship with them. You understand them in a way I never could from camera traps and tissue samples. So I'm asking, what serves their interests? And before you answer, know that doing nothing is also a choice with consequences. Climate change, habitat loss, disease, these threats don't care about privacy." I sat down across from her, and Ezra, who had been hiding in the tree line, slowly emerged. Margaret's eyes widened, but to her credit, she didn't move. didn't reach for her camera. "This is Ezra," I said quietly. "I found him during a blizzard 20 months ago. He was dying. I saved him, and in doing so, I became responsible for a secret I never asked for." Margaret watched as Ezra approached cautiously and settled beside me, his massive hand resting on my shoulder. Her professional composure cracked slightly, and I saw genuine wonder in her expression. "My God," she whispered. "He trusts you completely. I met his family 3 days ago, a group of 4, maybe more nearby. They communicate, they use tools, they have social structures. They're not animals, Margaret. They're people. Different, but people. Then they deserve recognition, protection. They've survived by remaining unrecognized. Every indigenous culture in this region has known about them for thousands of years, but never tried to prove their existence to outsiders. Why do you think that is?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching Ezra groom his hands with precise, almost human gestures. "Because proof would have destroyed them." "Yes. So what do I put in my report?" I took a breath, making the choice that would define everything. "You found evidence of unusual primate activity, consistent with reported sightings but insufficient for species classification. You recommend continued monitoring but advise against intensive investigation that might disturb potentially sensitive wildlife populations. You suggest the acoustic phenomena are likely elk, bear, and echo effects, and you close the case. You're asking me to lie in an official federal report. I'm asking you to choose their survival over scientific glory. I'm asking you to be the kind of scientist who understands that sometimes the greatest discovery is deciding not to make one." Margaret looked from me to Ezra and back again. In her eyes, I saw the war between professional duty and moral imperative, the same war I'd been fighting. Finally, she nodded. "I'll need a few days to fabricate plausible alternative explanations. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Because if I'm wrong, if they're discovered by someone less sympathetic, that's on both of us now." She stood to leave, then paused. "Does he have a name?" "Ezra." She smiled sadly. "Of course he does. You didn't just save him. You claimed him." She looked at Ezra one last time. "Take care of him. And if you can, ask him to take care of his family. Tell them there are humans who know and who chose silence. Maybe that means something." After she left, I sat with Ezra in the clearing, the weight of conspiracy settling over us like evening shadow. We had bought time, but time for what? Margaret kept her word. Her report, filed 10 days later, was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. Evidence suggests transient wildlife populations utilizing established migration corridors, acoustic phenomena attributed to natural environmental factors and known species vocalizations. No confirmation of undocumented primate species. Recommend periodic monitoring but advise against intensive investigation to prevent disruption of sensitive alpine ecosystems. The case was officially closed, but secrets have a way of metastasizing, and ours began to grow beyond our control. It started small. A blog post by a hiker who claimed to have seen a tall, ape-like figure near Cascade Pass. A blurry photograph, not of Ezra, thankfully, but perhaps of his father, posted to a cryptozoology forum. A podcast episode that dug up historical sightings from the North Cascades and theorized about an active population. Frank called me into his office on a gray September morning. "We're getting inquiries. Journalists, amateur researchers, even a documentary crew wanting permits for filming. The official line is, 'No unusual wildlife activity,' but," he looked at me over his reading glasses, "they're not going to stop, are they?" "No," I admitted. "The more we deny, the more convinced they become." "And your friend? Is he safe?" The question should have been absurd, referring to a 9-foot hominid as "my friend," but Frank had seen enough over the years to know that safety and size weren't correlated. He's been spending more time with his family group, learning their ways, but he still comes back to the cabin sometimes. I struggled for words. "I think he's trying to maintain connection to both worlds. That's not sustainable, Tom. Eventually he'll have to choose, or circumstances will choose for him." Frank was right, but neither of us knew how soon that choice would come. 3 weeks later, I was on a routine trail maintenance patrol when I encountered a group I'd never seen before. 5 men in expensive outdoor gear, carrying professional cameras and radio equipment. They had set up what could only be described as a surveillance camp in a meadow I knew Ezra's family frequented. "Private land?" their leader asked when I approached, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "National Park. You need a permit for commercial filming." "We have a research permit. We're documenting wildlife behavior." He showed me papers that were technically legitimate, approved for large mammal observation, vague enough to pass bureaucratic review. What species are you researching? He smiled. Whatever we find. I documented their location and reported it to Frank, who investigated their permits more carefully. The group was funded by a wealthy tech entrepreneur with a documented obsession with cryptozoology, someone with deep pockets and no scruples about bending rules. I can revoke the permits on technicalities, Frank said, but they'll just reapply, maybe come back without permission. You can't guard the entire park, Tom. He was right. The forest was vast, my resources limited, and now there were others. Casual hikers posting about strange sounds, teenagers making TikToks about Bigfoot hunting, a graduate student who wanted to do her dissertation on primate vocalization patterns in the Pacific Northwest. The pressure was building like water behind a cracking dam. I began finding evidence of human intrusion in areas I'd always considered safe. Candy wrappers near a territorial marker, cigarette butts by a tool cache, even a trail camera strapped to a tree overlooking one of the family's sheltered valleys. I destroyed the camera and documented its location. 3 days later, another appeared. This was no longer about managing a secret. This was about defending territory against an invasion. The crisis came on a cold October evening. I was at my cabin when Ezra arrived, moving faster than I'd ever seen him, his vocalizations urgent and distressed. He gestured toward the forest, the universal sign for "follow me." We ran through darkening trees, Ezra navigating with perfect confidence while I stumbled over roots and stones. After 20 minutes, I heard voices, angry, excited voices, and saw flashlight beams cutting through the twilight. We emerged at the edge of a clearing where Ezra's family had a seasonal shelter, and where the well-funded research team had set up an ambush of sorts. Motion-activated cameras, sound recording equipment, even what looked like tranquilizer dart rifles. The large male, Ezra's father, was confronting them, standing at full height in a display of threat that made the men back away despite their weapons. The female and juvenile had retreated into dense brush. The standoff was tense, dangerous, one startled finger pull away from violence. "Federal Park Ranger," I shouted, stepping into the clearing. "You're in violation of multiple regulations. Weapons are not permitted without specific authorization, and you're harassing wildlife." "It's not wildlife," the leader said, his eyes fixed on the massive hominid before him. "It's an undocumented species. This is history. This is their home, and you're trespassing." "With respect, Ranger, this discovery is bigger than property rights. The scientific community will never see your footage," I interrupted, "because I'm confiscating your equipment as evidence of wildlife harassment violations." It was legally questionable, but in that moment I didn't care. The male was seconds away from attacking. I could see it in his posture, in the tension of his massive shoulders. And if he did, someone would die, and the secret would explode beyond any hope of containment. "Ezra," I said quietly, "tell your father to stand down, please." Ezra moved forward, placing himself between his father and the humans, making soft vocalizations. The male responded, his tone sharp, but Ezra persisted. Slowly, incredibly, the male retreated, gathering his family and melting into the forest. The research team leader watched them disappear, then turned to me with an expression of pure fury. "You just cost humanity the greatest discovery of the century." "No," I said. "I just prevented you from turning sentient beings into specimens. Now give me your equipment and get out of this park. If I see you here again, I'll have you arrested." They left, but the damage was done. Word would spread. The footage they'd already captured, even without clear images, would fuel more interest, more intrusion, more danger. The dam had cracked, and I didn't know how to stop the flood. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion catastrophe. Despite my confiscation of equipment and Frank's official warnings, the researchers leaked their story. Park Ranger covers up Bigfoot evidence. The narrative spread through cryptozoology communities, then jumped to mainstream social media, then, horrifyingly, caught the attention of a cable news network running a slow news week. Suddenly, the North Cascades became a destination. Weekend warriors with cameras, professional trackers, college students on expeditions. The park's visitor numbers doubled, then tripled. Frank had to request additional rangers just to manage the crowds and protect sensitive habitats. "You've become the villain in their story," Frank told me. "The government agent hiding the truth." "Good," I said. "Better they focus on me than on finding Ezra's family." But I was losing control. The forest that had once been sanctuary was now under siege. I hadn't seen Ezra in 3 weeks, the longest separation since I'd found him. I told myself it was good, that he was integrating fully with his family. That distance was necessary for his survival. But at night, lying in my cabin, I felt his absence like a physical wound. Then, on a frost-sharp November morning, he returned. He looked different, leaner, his movements even more fluid, his eyes carrying a knowledge that hadn't been there before. He'd fully transitioned from the infant I'd saved to an adult member of his species. But when he saw me, he made the low, rumbling sound that meant greeting, and touched my shoulder in our shared gesture of connection. "You shouldn't be here," I told him. "It's not safe anymore." He gestured toward the forest, then to me, then made a complex series of signs I'd learned to interpret. Come, see, important. I followed him deep into territory I'd never explored, places so remote that even the influx of visitors wouldn't reach them. We climbed for hours, Ezra occasionally stopping to let me catch my breath, until we reached a high alpine valley ringed by peaks. There, in a natural amphitheater of stone and ancient cedar, I saw what Ezra wanted me to see. His family, yes, but not just the 4 I'd met before. At least 20 individuals, a true population with elders, adults, juveniles, infants. They had gathered from across their range, drawn together by some decision I couldn't fathom. The large male, Ezra's father, stood at the center. When he saw me, he made a sound that silenced all others. The gathering turned to watch as I approached, guided by Ezra. What happened next was beyond language, beyond anything I can fully convey. But I'll try. The elder male approached and gestured to the valley, then to the peaks, then made a sweeping motion that encompassed everything. His meaning was clear. This is our world. Then he gestured toward the forest below, where human voices occasionally echoed even here, and his expression changed, not to anger, but to something like sorrow. He touched Ezra's shoulder, then mine, then pressed his massive hand against his own chest. Family. We are family. You, him, us. Then he did something that made my throat close. He knelt, bringing his face level with mine, and placed his hand over his heart, then over mine. His eyes held mine with an intensity that conveyed meaning clearer than words ever could. You saved him. You protected us. But you cannot do this forever. So we give you a choice. He gestured to a young female, who brought forward something wrapped in cedar bark. Inside were items I recognized. Tools, dried plants, even a small carved figure that looked remarkably like Ezra as an infant. Gifts, remembrances. The message was clear. We must leave. Go deeper, higher, to places you cannot follow. But there was more. The elder male took my hand, his palm rough and warm, and placed it on Ezra's shoulder. Then he stepped back, his expression both questioning and resigned. He was giving me a choice. Ezra could come with me, live closer to the human world he'd been raised in, or he could go with his family, disappear into wilderness so remote that the human invasion couldn't reach it. The decision was mine. I looked at Ezra, this being I'd raised from near death, who had become more than a friend, more than a companion, who had become a bridge between species, between worlds. His eyes held the same question. Every instinct screamed to keep him, to hold on to this miracle, to not lose the connection that had defined my adult life. But this wasn't about what I needed. It had never been. You belong with them, I said, my voice breaking. You always have. I was just keeping you safe until you could go home. Ezra touched my face, the gesture gentle and deliberate. Then he touched his own chest, then mine. In the language we'd built together, you are family. This does not end. The elder male made a sound of approval, then gestured to the others. The gathering began to disperse, family groups moving toward the high passes that led deeper into the range. Ezra stayed for a moment longer. He reached into the folds of fur around his neck and pulled out something I'd given him years ago. A simple compass on a leather cord. He'd kept it all this time. Now he pressed it back into my hand and folded my fingers around it. A promise. I know how to find you. Then he turned and followed his family into the mountains. I watched until the last figure disappeared into morning mist, until even the sound of their passage faded into wind and silence. I stood alone in that alpine valley, holding a compass and a collection of gifts from a species that wasn't supposed to exist, and I wept. For loss, for love, for the impossible privilege of having touched something beyond human comprehension. The confrontation had been silent because words weren't needed. They had acknowledged what I'd done, honored it, and released us both from the obligation that had bound us. Some separations are not endings, they're transformations, and some secrets are kept not through deception, but through sacrifice. I didn't leave the valley until the sun was setting, painting the peaks in colors that seemed too beautiful for the ache in my chest. When I finally returned to civilization, if a ranger station could be called that, I found Frank waiting with news. "The media frenzy is dying down," he said. "No concrete evidence emerged and people are losing interest. Another week and we'll be back to normal." Normal. The word felt like it belonged to a different language. I filed my incident report. No unusual wildlife activity observed, and returned to regular duties. The gift bundle from Ezra's family I locked in a secure location, documentation of something the world would never see. Dr. Voss called 3 months later. "I heard you had some trouble with amateur researchers. Are they safe? The family? They've moved deeper into the backcountry, beyond casual reach." "Good." A pause. "I think about them sometimes, about what we chose. Do you regret it?" "No. But I wonder if future generations will forgive us for not documenting them while we could. Maybe future generations will thank us for letting them remain undocumented. Maybe." 20 years have passed since that morning in the Alpine Valley. I'm 44 now, still a ranger, though I've turned down every promotion that would take me away from these mountains. Frank retired 5 years ago, and I'm now the senior ranger for the North Cascades District. The forest has reclaimed its silence. The media attention faded as predicted. Occasional enthusiasts still come looking for evidence, but they find nothing, because there's nothing left to find. The family moved to territories so remote that even experienced mountaineers rarely venture there. I've seen Ezra 3 times in 20 years. The first was 5 years after our separation. I was camped in a high valley when I woke to find him sitting by my tent. Older now, with scars on his arms and a presence that spoke of leadership. We sat together in silence, sharing dried fruit I'd brought, and a connection that needed no words. At dawn, he touched my shoulder and left. The second time was 12 years later. He brought a juvenile with him. His son, I realized with a shock that made me laugh and cry simultaneously. The youngster watched me with wary curiosity, while Ezra made soft sounds of reassurance. Before leaving, Ezra touched my face, then his son's, and I understood. This is my father's father. Remember him. The third time was just last year. Ezra is 41 now by my calculation, and showing his age, silver in his fur, movements slightly less fluid. But his eyes still held that intelligence, that recognition. He brought me a gift, a carved figure of a ranger holding an infant. The craftsmanship was remarkable, the symbolism clear. Some stories become myths, others become memories held by a single witness. I've never spoken publicly about what I know. Dr. Chen passed away 7 years ago, taking her knowledge with her. Margaret Voss retired and moved to New Zealand, as far from her old life as she could get. My father died peacefully at 89. His last words to me, "You chose well, son. Not every truth needs to be told." Sometimes, late at night, I take out the compass Ezra returned to me and hold it, feeling the weight of years and choices. The gifts from his family are still locked away, seen by no one. When I die, they'll be buried with me, evidence that will return to the earth that created it. People still ask if I believe in Bigfoot. I always say the same thing. The forest holds more mysteries than we'll ever solve. And maybe that's how it should be. There are younger rangers now who patrol these mountains with their GPS and satellite phones, who document everything with digital precision. They don't understand why I still prefer paper maps and film cameras, why I sometimes disappear for days into the backcountry without radio contact. They don't know that I'm checking on a family that trusts me to remain their secret. Last week I found fresh territorial markers in a valley I hadn't visited in months, scratches at 10 feet, arranged in patterns I recognize. Ezra's son, perhaps, or his grandson. The population endures, adapting, surviving in the spaces between human awareness. Climate change threatens their range. I document the changes, file reports about habitat preservation, push for expanded wilderness protections, all without explaining my real motivation. I've become very good at protecting them through proxy, at serving their interests while appearing to serve only general conservation goals. Some nights I hear them, the calls that carry across ridges, that sound like wind until you know what to listen for. I don't respond, that boundary is important, but I stand on my porch and listen and I know they're still there, still hidden, still free. I've thought often about Margaret's question, will future generations forgive us? I don't know. Maybe they'll discover the truth through evidence we couldn't erase. Maybe they'll develop technology that makes hiding impossible. Maybe Ezra's descendants will face choices we couldn't imagine. But for now, for these 20 years, they've had peace, space, the freedom to exist without being specimens, exhibits, or proof of anything except their own right to survival. I saved an injured infant in a snowstorm 2 decades ago. I thought I was rescuing him, but maybe, probably, he was rescuing me, teaching me that some miracles are meant to be witnessed, not announced. That stewardship sometimes means silence, that the greatest act of love can be letting go. There are still places where the world resists in silence, where ancient intelligence moves through shadows and mist, where families gather in valleys unknown to GPS coordinates and social media tags. I was privileged to glimpse that world, and my privilege is keeping it secret. Some stories end with revelation. This one ends with concealment, and I hope that's exactly as it should be.